Welcome to After Hours with Dr. Sigaloff, where he can share ideas and thoughts with you. He gets to the heart of the issue so that you can find the truth. The views and opinions expressed are his and do not represent the U.S. Army, DoD, nor the U.S. government. Dr. Sigaloff was either off duty or on approved leave, and Dr. Sigaloff was not in uniform at the time of recording. Now, to Dr. Sigaloff.
Well, thanks for joining me again. I first want to start off by thanking all my Patreon supporters. We've got in the Pandemic Reprimando the $17.76 of support a month. We have Samuel Shelkey. We have Perry. The custom-made $10 level is Kevin Alanos and Katie Victoria. And then we have some other supporters at the $5 level, Joe and PJ. I want to thank you all very much for helping support. You know, this is a big fight, and there are plenty of legal fees that go along with this, and I truly appreciate your help. Also, throughout this, I don't get paid for this. I was given this for free, and this was by my friends over at the Mustard Seed Shop, and they have these available for you. Again, this is not... they haven't paid me to say this, and I don't have any discount codes for you, but they're good people over there. They're also veterans. They're also fighting the same fight, and this was a free gift from them to me. So I want to, if y'all can show them any love, if you can show them any support, if you can see, I'll put some pictures in there also. But today we have a wonderful guest. His name is Luke, and Luke has a very interesting background. So he is an interrogator, and he's also a linguist, which are two very important things. And the other day when I was talking to Luke, I came to the conclusion, because many conversations I've had with service members have been like the conversations I've had with Luke, just these brilliant conversations, well-educated, self-taught. And it's almost like for the past 2 years, every service member that's on this side of this argument who hasn't got the shot or is going to resist future shots, they seem to have given themselves a self-education, like a PhD level education in medicine, in law, in language, in all these areas. And so that's one of the good things. You know, there's plenty of bad things that have come out of COVID, but one of the good things is we've increased our education by ourselves. Many people have gone and just learned these things, and they're experts in this field, even though they don't have the PhD or the MD or the DO or all these letters behind their name. But when someone has spent time, as much time as, let's say, Luke has and many other service members I've talked to, it's important to still hear from them. And in the future, like my kids, they won't go to college. College won't be a thing like it is now, and those letters behind their name won't matter. So this is the beginning of that new era. But Luke, pleasure to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Sam. That's great. You know, it's a really good point you made there about people being self-educated and the letters after their names not really mattering. There was an E5 medical equipment repairman that I talked to yesterday, and what he said was, well, I may not be a very well-educated man. I don't consider myself to be that intelligent. And I said, well, you figured out a lot of stuff that guys in white coats haven't been able to figure out. And he says, well, yeah, I wasn't indoctrinated. He says, the first thing that my parents would make me do as a kid on my way to school was to recite verses from Romans 12 about renewing my mind. And he says it prevented me from being indoctrinated. And I said, hey, there you go. That sounds pretty good. You know, are you going to regurgitate that which an education system ordered you to regurgitate, or are you going to think? And he chose option B, and, well, he's doing pretty well for himself.
Right. Oh, and one more thing that I forgot to mention is any view expressed today by Luke or by myself is our own opinion, is not that of the Department of the Army, not the DoD, nor the U.S. government.
I think your listeners are going to figure that out pretty quickly if they haven't already. But yeah, that's a fair point.
Slightly different opinions, yes.
Slightly different, right? Although, oddly enough, I will say that we do follow AR 600-20, even if the general staff doesn't. I will say that we abide by the opinions of the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army that were at least important enough to them that they enshrined it in regulation, even if they no longer care to follow said regulations.
I love it. It's good.
Unfortunately, yeah. Yeah, thanks. So I was going to say the way a lot of this started for me was as a translator, I started realizing that a lot of people could be fooled by certain things, and a lot of the reasons that they could be deceived, or one of the many reasons they could be deceived, is because they weren't familiar enough with their own language. So when people redefine terms, or people misuse terms regularly, or people outright fabricated new terminology for whatever purposes in social engineering it was really meant for, because people didn't know their own language well enough, they weren't really in a good position to defend truth or to defend the integrity of the language as they should have been able to. And I think the same thing happens in all walks of life. I think it happens in law. People who aren't familiar enough with the law can be bamboozled or fooled by lawyers or fooled by any number of people who are trying to abusively harm them using the law as a weapon, weaponizing law, weaponizing language. And I think the same thing happens with faith. A lot of people who don't know their faith well enough can be led astray. Similar kinds of problems happen in all walks of life. But I realize with language, he who controls a language controls a culture. And that certainly appears to be the case here. A lot of things have been pulled off in the last couple of years, partly because redefinition of terminology is now extremely commonplace and widespread, unfortunately. One of the things that I know you and I have talked about is misapplication of terminology or outright redefinition of terminology. So, for example, the CDC redefining the term vaccine is a good example of that, where they now no longer have to pretend that they're giving you immunity. Well, back in the day, we heard all numbers of excuses for why people still got the flu after getting the flu shot. Why did that happen? Well, it was a different strain. We were taking a gamble on which strain it was going to be this year, so you got the shot for the wrong variant. But the military happened to purchase all of these vials for this particular variant, apparently, and they lost the gamble. So then everybody was forced to take a gamble with getting all sorts of neurological issues and all sorts of toxemia issues because they were gambling with whether the Army's gamble was actually going to pay off. So we were basically 2 degrees of gambling there. And now they don't even have to pretend that it's going to give you immunity. If you get sick after you take something, it's because it didn't actually guarantee you any protection against it in the first place. So I think that the mask is coming off for a lot of people now. I think there's a lot more truth being spoken because, well, they need to redefine things in order to get away with things in court. Because as you and Dr. Thorpe said, you'll be at Nuremberg if this, depending on how this goes, I'll be in Poland, right there with you guys. So.
Well, and one thing that I've recently discovered, and this bothers me, just because we've done things this way in the past doesn't mean that we should continue to do them this way in the future. And yes, there's been these mandates and these requirements for flu vaccine, but truly, and this is an argument, a legal argument that maybe we'll have after these COVID arguments are won. But who are you? And I don't mean you, Luke. I mean, but you, the commander, to order me to take a vaccine, any medical treatment. Because if I'm being ordered to take a medical treatment by a commander, then I've lost my autonomy. I no longer have free will, which that's a Article 13 issue, or the 13th Amendment issue. I'm sorry, the 13th Amendment issue. And who's practicing medicine without a license now?
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed that a lot of people became self-proclaimed physicians as soon as the media, the same media that told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, was now telling us how virology and pathology work. So that was, we already 1 degree separated from reality by going along with what mainstream media decided to put together with all their pharmaceutical sponsors. And then from there, people started saying any number of things, being self-proclaimed experts on this. And I realized early on that things were going to start deteriorating pretty quickly, especially when you saw Ezike from the Illinois Public Health Department come out and say, even if you died of a clear alternate cause, we'd be listing you as a COVID death. Okay, well, what's COVID mean in that case? What does death really mean in that case? And we started seeing just language games all over the place. This wasn't about science at this point. It was about language. It was about linguistics. And I noticed that over the years, and this is something that we can see pretty clearly that goes back to the 1920s, or actually 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution, redefinition of terminology was used to actually bludgeon opponents and shut down debate and dissent in many cases. There was a lot of Trotskyite terminology that you and I had talked about the other day when it comes to names that people are called or insults that are hurled at people in order to try and debase or discredit their opponents. And we started seeing that a lot too with anti-science, anti-vaccine, anyone who opposed the status quo, which, well, used to be a cool thing. Going against the establishment, standing up to the man. That doesn't appear to be the case anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is that people have legitimately become religious when it comes to following something that they see as scientific. One of the patterns I noticed, though, is that redefinition of terminology or misuse of terminology is required for that in the first place. So right now we're looking at a bunch of different measures and a bunch of different medical treatments, including forced ones, that are based on germ theory, which remains a theory after hundreds of years. Now, why is that? Why is theory treated as fact? So first, and this is something else that happens, is even something that's used to explain the origins of mankind or the origin of the universe is called a theory. But if we follow the scientific method, a hypothesis must first be tested and then produce some observable or repeatable result in order to become a theory. So the Big Bang Theory that explains all life on Earth for the secularists is actually the Big Bang hypothesis. So the hypothesis is artificially, linguistically elevated to the status of theory, and then theory is misused to be treated as fact, just as the theory of macroevolution or the theory of cosmic evolution is. And then it turns out that once you have a quote theory, you can actually just treat it as a religious dogma that a bunch of people will follow, and you can do whatever you want to them with that.
Isn't that wild? Like these things that we haven't been able to prove, we're holding people's feet to the fire.
Oh yeah, 100%. And then of course we're also talking about blending of terminology. For example, when someone says, do you believe in science? Okay, well, what is science? Well, collection and observation of data. Okay, and experimentation and things like that. But then from there, it has all sorts of implications all sorts of conclusions that people are expected to follow because there are hypotheses that are allegedly settled, because there are theories that are allegedly settled, and then there are facts that are allegedly settled when all you have in many cases is just a hypothesis. And to be fair, some of the people on the fringes, some of the most ridiculous people, such as Georgios Tsoukalos, the guy with all the wild and crazy hair from Ancient Aliens, a lot of people know him from there. Well, a lot of times the guys on the show are described as the ancient astronaut theory when it's actually the ancient astronaut hypothesis. And in 1997, with the most normal hair and most normal clothing anyone will ever see Georgios Tsoukalos wear, he did say that it was actually the ancient astronaut hypothesis. But he was actually much like a mainstream modern scientist in his approach to this, because he said the only way that the ancient astronaut hypothesis could be disproven is if the extraterrestrials themselves show up in the flesh and say, we were never here. Well, there's a little bit of presumption, I'd say, in his explanation of that hypothesis, but that's unfortunately very much a mainstream thing now, because so many things are accepted as dogmatic fact, and so many hypotheses or theories that are elevated to religious dogma for them are dependent upon those presumptions.
Let's get into some of those other language or vernacular issues that you had brought up when we talked about the other day, because those were really interesting, and it kind of lends to that idea of confusion of the languages. If you look back to Genesis and the Tower of Babel, and how you can have two people talking, communicating,
absolutely,
speaking the same language, but yet completely misunderstand each other.
Oh yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It does go all the way back to Genesis, and it's been written about all throughout mankind's history. And I think one of the reasons that this is done, one of the reasons that the language is intentionally manipulated by people, is actually to break down the ability of the common man to interact and communicate. Our ability, we should be able to be heard. People talk about, well, there are those without voices. There are those who feel disfranchised. There are those who feel cast aside because they're not heard. Well, one of the greatest ways to make sure that people aren't heard is to take their language and make it impossible for other people to understand. And I think we've seen quite a bit of that, because two people could use the exact same terminology and then not understand the other person because something is allegedly so contextually dependent or has so many different connotations. So, I mean, I was arguing with someone the other day about the word complain. And the individual in question had said, well, that just sounds like someone's griping or whining or moaning. And I said, well, then what do you do with a formal complaint? when someone petitions a court with a legitimate legal document for a formal complaint as a plaintiff, is he just whining and moaning to the judge? No, not at all. He's filed a legal motion. Um, and the connotations were just not understood because of how people so often see words used. But that's more of a dictionary issue. The fact of the matter is now we have dictionaries catching up with misuse of terminology. The dictionary is no longer a standard. The dictionaries are often malleable. And we started seeing that with misused words. So, for example, disfranchised is the word I just used a couple of seconds ago. People often say disenfranchised. Well, you're taking a positive and a negative. We're going to start, if we're dealing with math here, we've been multiplying things by I and then asking whether they're real. So if we have someone could be enfranchised or someone could be disfranchised. Well, if someone's disenfranchised, he's just franchised. At that point, you're talking about someone who may as well be a McDonald's location or a Waffle House. And that's another example with disbark versus disembark. You would embark on a voyage or a journey, or you would disbark to get off the ship. Well, disembark would just be bark. At that point, we're talking about people who are basically dogs. And once people misuse these words, such as irregardless and things like that, just adding different prefixes or prefaces or suffices, the dictionary eventually catches up to the misuse of these things in the vernacular, and the language becomes dumbed down. Now, that in and of itself isn't necessarily toxic or harmful, but it does muddy the waters a little bit. And the more confusing things are, the more concealment there is, the more darkness there is, whether we're talking linguistically or physically, that's where predators hide. Predators hide in areas that are dark. Predators hide in areas loaded with concealment. Start throwing off smoke grenades and the enemy's going to have a lot more places to hide in. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing happen here. Because I do remember, as a translator especially, the word gender has a specific meaning as a linguistic concept. In the Romance languages and in Arabic and things like that, we're talking about masculine and feminine words. But we don't have that concept in English. We also don't have that concept in Persian Farsi. So when someone wants to introduce Dr. John Money's, quote, theories from the 1950s, which involved, unfortunately, a series of experiments with real horrible harm and experimentation on children with hormone therapies and other things, we started seeing that by 2015, Webster had changed the word gender to add an additional definition to say that it was a state of being that was separate from sex. Well, people were misusing the word gender because it's a linguistic concept that doesn't exist in English. So they didn't know that it was actually just a grammatical structure that people were talking about. They thought that it was actually something different, and a whole lot of social engineering stemmed off from that. And we can see that people's opinions on things that a few years ago they would have said were completely absurd now seem to be completely okay because of media and because of social pressures and because of the dictionary actually changing in order to go along with this, with a concerted effort to make those things change in people's minds.
And one thing I've noticed about that is these, people use the word gender, or I guess probably gender, when they really maybe mean gender roles, which are completely different, because that's more of a construct thing, like, oh, the gender role is a man does this and a woman does that. And since some people are like, well, since I like to do things that are more, I'm a man, but I do things that are more like what women typically do, then I must be a woman, which that's completely wrong, right? You can be very effeminate, and still be a man. And you can be very masculine and still be a woman. That doesn't change your gender. It may change like the traditional social norms or gender roles of a job. But I once had a patient come to me, and his probably 9-year-old daughter was there in the room. And he was saying how she wanted to become, the dad was saying how she wanted to become a man. And I said, well, okay, let's explore this a little bit. Why does she think she can do that? And it's because she wants to be like her dad, and her dad works on cars. Well, she can be like her dad, and she can work on cars. That doesn't mean she needs to have hormone therapy, and and so this dad was quite reassured, and he was happy that his daughter doesn't need to change gender just because she likes to work on cars. That is the spice of life, and that's what makes the world such an amazing place, is we can all be different, but we are what we have been made, right? You can't change the very essence of your DNA.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between being a tomboy or a bit of a tomboy or having those tendencies and wanting to be like dad and pharmaceutical companies needing to make a ton of money off of a lifelong customer. I almost said patient, but I want to say lifelong customer. And the pharmaceutical companies are not concerned about the fact that the life expectancy would be much shorter. And that's
Right.
another horribly sad thing. We are talking about people who have absolutely no regard for the life of children. And that's been made pretty clear, not just by things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or others bring up in that regard, but the angle that they attack pharmaceutical companies from. But it's pretty out in the open now with things like what you just described, where a father was like, well, do I have to ask a doctor about the options to explore here for something that would have just been completely normal and understandable even just 5 or 10 years ago?
And a lot of
That's
that's due to this language issue that we're talking about when we confuse this idea of gender roles, if that's even the proper term for that, and gender, and how gender now means sex when, or gender quit meaning sex,
Yeah.
and it meant this other idea, and then they get blended together, and then we try to pull them apart again. You've got people trying to change the very DNA of their body, which can't be done.
right. And another thing I thought of with this word theory, do you ever notice how people who like to misuse the word theory essentially to treat it as fact, whether we're talking about gender theory or whether we're talking about germ theory or the Big Bang theory, which can't even be tested, by the way. It's always going to have to be a hypothesis just because of its limitations with the scientific method, unless, of course, you bring up a new definition of the word theory, which some people do. But you ever notice how theory can be something that's equivalent to fact or dogma for these people? Unless it's something they don't like, then it becomes a conspiracy theory, where the same word is used to describe something so absurd that it couldn't possibly be real. But in the next breath, theory is something that's so dogmatic that it can't be rejected or defied by any man. And unfortunately, we see quite a bit of that. Now, you're right that this does go back to Genesis, but there's another good example of it with more recent history. We can see that Pope Pius VI, for example, wrote an apostolic constitution in 1794, Auctorem Fidei, and he was writing about, in the beginning of it, he was writing about the heretic Nestorius in the year 430. And what Pope Pius VI said was, the heretic Nestorius expressed himself in a plethora of words, mixing true things with others that were obscure, mixing at times one with the other in such a way that he was also able to confess those things which were denied, while at the same time possessing a basis for denying those very sentences which he confessed. And so people can use the exact same words to mean opposite things within the same sentence or paragraph and not see that there's a real issue with a paradox there. And not do anything to adjust the way that they speak or communicate with others.
Well, and that's interesting too, because if it's the truth, it's 100% true. And not my truth, but the truth is what we're talking about here. But if it's 99% true and then 1% wrong, it's still all wrong. And that's how the devil works.
Yeah.
That's how the devil
exactly
knocks
right.
down that wall.
Yeah, and actually Pope Leo XIII said the same thing in Satis Cognitum, I believe it was in Satis Cognitum number 9, that there could be no one more dangerous than those who accept nearly the entirety of Christian teaching, and then with one word, as with a drop of poison, infect the true faith of our Lord and handed down by the apostles. And that drop of poison's there. But I think that's got to do with muddying the waters as well. I think the reason that predators are able to hide so easily is because things are confusing. You know, if we were to take a glass of red wine and you swirl it and you look at it and smell it and you can see the legs and everything like that, depending on the consistency of the wine, let's say you have a port or something like that, there's a reason that things with strong flavor and certain viscosities were always used to conceal poisons throughout history. So if I wanted to get someone to drink automatic transmission fluid and I wanted to take some red-dyed automatic transmission fluid, I know exactly what I could put it in. You know, it's got a little bit of a sweet smell. I'm going to put it in a port. Well, I think what's happening now is, with the way things have been poisoned by pharmaceutical companies, by social engineers, is they kind of overstepped their bounds to such an extent that their wine supplies are running really low, but they still have a whole lot of tranny fluid. And we're actually at the point now where things are so out in the open that people who were previously handed a glass of red wine, a sweet red wine, mixed with a little bit of automatic transmission fluid are now actually being handed a glass of automatic transmission fluid and being told that it's red wine. And even someone with the worst sense of smell or the worst sense of taste can tell that he's drinking something made by a petroleum company and not by a vineyard.
Yeah, I like that analogy. That's pretty good because, I mean...
Yeah, thanks.
Society is drinking poison at this moment, and proof of it is they're asking for amnesty. I don't know if you saw that recently.
No, I did not.
Yeah, there's an
Who was
article
asking
out there
for amnesty?
That any of the COVID stuff that happened, we want amnesty. Just forgive us. Just forgive us. And like my neighbor, I can forgive my neighbor. The guy I work with, the guy at church, I can forgive them because they're not responsible for giving good information, giving the full truth. But people who are at the policy level, the people who have given direct orders for people to get this experimental medical treatment, I can still forgive them. They need to be held legally accountable. And I'm not calling for vigilante justice at all. I would never call for that.
No, I definitely totally wouldn't. Like I told you the other day as well, I wouldn't do that either. But I also think that the only reason that these orders were able to be handed down in the first place was because of language games in what people sometimes call legalese. But even legalese was cast aside. You know, this is an issue, and I know this may turn into an ongoing case, so I probably shouldn't give too many details about the specifics of the things I saw at Fort Huachuca, but when we're talking about specifically as far as publicly available information goes, that memorandum from the Undersecretary of Defense or Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Services with interchangeable versus interchangeably, two drugs that remained legally distinct then could be mandated, things that, I mean, the word approval came in, a really, really big misuse of the word approval. I mean, how many times, for example, did you hear Pfizer's approved, whatever that means, over the last year and a half or so, right? People were perfectly fine with saying, well, Pfizer's approved. Now it's like, well, that's interesting, because now we can just start saying, here's a manufacturer that makes hundreds of products or possibly thousands of products, and it is approved. And like you were saying the other day with Chad, I mean, you don't ask for Coca-Cola labeled cans at a restaurant. You ask for Coca-Cola. Well, if Coca-Cola is approved, and you go into a restaurant and someone says, well, it's Sprite. Sprite can be used interchangeably with it, and it's made by the Coca-Cola Corporation. Well, Sprite and Coke can be used interchangeably for making people fat or making kids stay up all night. There's no doubt about that, because you're going to have similar ingredients and overlapping ingredients, just like Pfizer and the FDA say that they have. You're dealing with high fructose corn syrup. So they're also used interchangeably for making sure that people become long-term insulin customers of pharmaceutical companies. But you're handing someone something that was evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and then saying that the other product made by the same company with some overlap and some interchangeability is then the same product. And I'm sorry, I would think, because it comes from the biggest convicted felon in medical fraud history, that both vials are loaded with automatic transmission fluid, but they don't belong on the shelf at a wine store as a result. But that doesn't mean they're the same. You know, you go into AutoZone, you don't have to be looking for wine, but if you go into AutoZone, you're going to find several different brands of automatic transmission fluid on the wall there. Just like if you're at a liquor store looking for wine.
Right. And, I mean, to kind of even further that point of confusion of the language is when was it Frago 5 came out, and it said very specifically, and if you knew that there was a difference, you could see it. But it said, you know, it's a lawful order to mandate that soldiers or service members get whatever FDA approved vaccine, and then, or they may volunteer to take Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, whichever it is. But it said Comirnaty was one, and then it said or, which starts a new idea, new sentence. They can stand alone, and you can volunteer to take this other product that we're going to start using that name interchangeably to confuse you, and they do that through the rest of the thing, because Comirnaty is a specific product, and the Pfizer/BioNTech is not the name of Comirnaty. It's a mix of the companies that are working together to make Comirnaty, but it's not the same product. And they start using that Pfizer-BioNTech through the rest of the document.
Oh, yeah. No, and that's exactly what I saw. I mean, one of my soldiers drew my attention to that with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., showing that this is exactly what Pfizer had begun to do when it started seeking BLA for Comirnaty. But what I think is interesting is that throughout that article, you have a lawyer there, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a very successful attorney, who I think has done a lot of good work in this regard. He's constantly using the word vaccine, but why is he using the word vaccine? Well, what does vaccine mean? Nowadays, that's a good question, because it's legitimately been redefined, at least in CDC documents. We can see that they have a new definition of vaccine, and that was allegedly in order to make these ones fit the definition of a vaccine. So originally it was these soldiers have to take an approved vaccine regimen, but now soldiers don't necessarily know what vaccine even means. And then you're dealing with multiple entities with conflicting definitions. So while the CDC might change their definition of vaccine, that doesn't mean that Congress changed its definition of vaccine with various statutes that you and I were going over the other day to include the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. So there are definitions of terms that are now, I mean, if these things are vaccines, which they don't appear to be, and then, of course, if Dr. Lanka is correct and Enders was wrong, then vaccine science doesn't really mean much anyway. I mean, and it all goes back to cattle, vacus in Latin, meaning cow. Is that because of cowpox or because people just like cattle are being shoved full of experimental drugs? I don't know.
And another thing you had mentioned was the idea of the FDA approved. And then they'll say how Pfizer is FDA approved when really it's under emergency use authorization. So in reality, it's authorized to be used. It's not approved. And you'll hear, like, go back and listen to news reports. You'll hear all these news and all these, even like doctors and all these people say, oh, it's approved under EUA. Well, is it authorized or is it approved?
Oh, yeah.
Is it because those are different things. You can't say it's authorized and approved. It's either authorized, meaning it's gone through all the safety standards, which all of those are in question now, or I'm sorry, it's approved and it's gone through all the safety regulations, or it's authorized and you may use it, but good luck. Hopefully it works out well for you.
Yeah, actually, I thought it could be authorized and approved at the same time, because supposedly if Comirnaty is interchangeable with BioNTech and their formula is almost the same and they can be used interchangeably with the same level of effectiveness and safety, not efficacious, they say effective instead of efficacious, which is another thing you pointed out, but you can have allegedly the exact same formulation of a drug under EUA in the US, under CMA in Germany, and then supposedly also under BLA, which they then claim is full approval in the US when it's supposedly all the exact same formulation. So maybe it can be approved and authorized at the same time. Although
right,
that's not really legal.
Right. And the BLA argument is an argument that the DoD made that is purely fictitious because they made it up after they were in court. They never had that argument. They never made that stance prior to going to court to try and defend themselves. And so it's purely fictitious. It's like, oh man, we've been called on this. What do we come up with? Let me throw a dart at a dartboard. BLA, let's try that and see if that works.
I think that was Judge Alan Windsor's ruling in Pensacola last year, correct? Where he said it was legally unconvincing, even though he dismissed the motion for those 16 sailors. He said the DoD's argument was legally unconvincing. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that was...
Well, that was Judge Alan Windsor.
I believe so.
Well, chipping away at medical terminology, though, is completely fine now. Because, I mean, what we've been talking about here is use of medical terms, but medical terms have been under attack for quite some time. And one good example of this is, when we look at, obviously, because you're a doctor, how many words come from Greek or Latin in medicine. There are tons of them, and that's what doctors supposedly spend most of their time learning, is essentially learning a new language, or an old language, I suppose you could say. But we've started to see words that are fabricated, because we've talked about words that are redefined, we've talked about words that are misused, and then we talk about words that are outright fabricated and created specifically for the purposes of social engineering, or created specifically for nefarious purposes, or for bludgeoning opponents. And a great example of this is when I was younger, you know, I think I was a teenager. It must have been, because this was on MySpace. All right, this was a little while ago, where people were throwing out the term homophobe and calling people homophobes, because that's what you did on MySpace apparently. And I remember looking at a list of legitimate phobias and legitimate medical terms, and seeing that that was listed on there. And I said, well, this doesn't make any sense, because we have arachnophobia, we have a Greek prefix and a Greek suffix, fear of spiders, and we're talking about legitimate phobia, an actual legitimate irrational fear that people have to describe essentially a medical condition. And agoraphobia, people are afraid of going outside, fear of the marketplace. Well, then we started seeing things such as homophobia. It's like, okay, well, if we were to say, you know, we're looking at a Greek prefix, a Greek suffix here, is it fear of the same? Because that's what it would have to be, right? Well, no, okay, well, let's mix it with the Latin, you know, homo erectus, homo sapiens. Okay, so it's fear of man, fear of humankind. No, it's not, it's fear of homosexuals. Like, well, how is that possible? Because you're dealing with a suffix here that has to be misused. And then I looked and saw that essentially people were claiming that you could make a legitimate medical term by taking a prefix from a slang abbreviation in English and then mixing it with a Greek suffix in order to create a legitimate medical term or to describe a social or medical phenomenon. And then the word phobia was then rebranded or redefined in that context to mean hatred or dislike. So we were 3 degrees separated from reality with one made-up term. And then we saw the exact same thing with Islamophobia, because if we're looking at the Arabic language here, Islam means submission. So, okay, Islamophobia, if we're going to now mix Arabic with Greek, because apparently that's okay to do now too, we have fear of submission. Well, fear of submission to what? Well, fear of submission to God and perfect submission to God's will, which is the only context that Islam would work for the word Islamophobia. So, and then it is redefined again to mean dislike of Muslims. But wouldn't that be Muslim phobia or just dislike of Muslims? These words are all fake. And this is a real problem. People use these words to bludgeon people. But whenever I hear someone use those words, I realize that someone is actually just regurgitating things. Kind of like what we talked about earlier with that guy who pointed that medical equipment repairman who said, well, I haven't been indoctrinated. But those who have been indoctrinated believe that they're intelligent by using, and believe that using these terms makes them sound intelligent, when in reality, it makes them sound like automatons. We're dealing with people who are using copy and paste terminology to try and describe a phenomenon that doesn't even make sense. Like those words don't actually convey that meaning. So people are then conditioned to accept the meaning of these terms, regardless of whether these terms are real. And then other people who are used to hearing those words then don't know how to use the individual components of those words. So I think about the Germans, for example. Germans have extremely long words. They can break those words down into various things. And Persians use a ton of compound words. You know, for example, their word for ostrich is camel chicken, or their word, especially in Afghanistan, for turkey is elephant chicken. It's okay to take weird words and shove them together like that. When you break those words apart, you still have the intact meanings there. You know, camel still means camel, and chicken still means chicken. By the time you're done breaking down homophobia or Islamophobia, those words, those individual components of those words, do not mean what they have to mean when they're combined together. It's more like chemistry than anything else, to be honest. Like pharmakia is chemistry. I guess if we were to take sodium chloride, you can have 2 toxic substances that come together to make a non-toxic substance, or in this case, the opposite, where you take multiple non-toxic substances and put them together to get a toxic one.
Yeah, they should be able to, like with stoichiometry and chemistry, like you were saying, what you put in has to be on the other side. And
yeah. It's like pharmakia for words, right? I'm sorry if I buried it in a bunch of stuff. Remember how I was talking about how, you can hide a bunch of stuff when things are obfuscated deliberately or confusing? Yeah, sorry. If I threw too much out there and something got lost or hidden, then I do apologize for that, yeah. But
yeah, no worries.
No, well, so I was gonna say that something you had brought up was where words are actually presented to people people are accustomed to seeing a word presented to them. They're used to seeing something in a particular context, and then something is swapped on them. So, for example, if we looked at messenger RNA, people see mRNA and think messenger RNA, and then the company that makes a chemotherapy or gene therapy cancer treatment, allegedly, is called Mode RNA, which is then Moderna. They just changed the pronunciation of it. But then whenever people see the mRNA product from Mode RNA, they're not thinking modified RNA, they're thinking messenger RNA, and they're thinking about some kind of helpful enhancement for them. But I think you had said that you saw that in their documents that they had actually specified that this was modified as opposed to messenger.
I saw that specifically in the Pfizer. I would imagine that Moderna or Mod RNA would also do the same thing because that's what they base their technology on, and they actually have never brought anything to market in the entire time that company has existed until this alleged vaccine, this gene therapy, which is gene therapy based on the FDA definition of gene therapy from 2018.
Right. Which I guess you could say is subject to change, because if people catch on to that and it becomes problematic for them, legally speaking, or otherwise, or something hurts sales, and that's entirely possible that they could change that. But I remember there was a conversation, I was talking to Dr. Lee Merritt a few days ago. I remember there was an interview that she had with Dr. Tom Cowan, where Tom Cowan was talking about this same issue of how words in medicine are put together. So, for example, they were talking about the word ribosome, and he goes, "Well, what's a ribosome? How does this work?" You know, because he was talking about biology in that case, and he said ribosoma, rib from the body, and Dr. Merritt says, "Well, now we're talking to Adam and Eve," and he goes, "Yes, so all these building blocks come from a rib from the body, from Adam and Eve," and then Cowan says, "Well, that means they're messing with you," which he's right in a sense. If we're talking about how something that supposedly explains the origins of things then goes back to clearly religious concept, then I think we can start seeing how words are created.
Well, and it's interesting how we create words to mean things, but how, you know, and this is a bit of a tangent on how my brain works, but everything was created by words from God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah. Yep, in John chapter 1, yeah. By whom all things were made, yeah. Without him, nothing was made that was made. Right, yeah. No, that's true, and everything is created. And I think that's one of the reasons that communication and words have to be destroyed so badly by social engineers. I mean, in order for deception to come in, we have to look at what has to be done to words. Because if we think about what a lie actually is, I mean, if we're talking this in military concept, we're talking about MILDAC, right? And military deception. Deception is perfectly fine as a tactic of war. You want to deceive the enemy, you want to trick him, and you want to be able to save the lives of your men and do some harm to his by using deception. Well, a lie is actually a carefully crafted weapon of war whenever there's a lie employed against someone. Whenever someone tells a lie to somebody else, what he's actually doing is misusing the gift of language and the ability to communicate, which can be used for wonderful things, and it's meant to be used to tell the truth. But he's actually carefully crafting a weapon to be used against someone else to cause misdirection or to cause harm, in the same way you would in a war. And I would say that, unfortunately, how deception works.
I would say that you're right. It is a war. It may not be a war with flesh and blood, but it's a war in the unseen realm, and that is always a part that's engaged in the world. You know, there's always that fight where there's the unseen realm that's Satan and his fallen angels trying to destroy humanity, and so it makes sense that this is a weapon of war, because it truly is a weapon of war that's always being fought, even if it's not countries fighting. It's this unseen realm where God is trying to save us by saying, "Hey, I'm right here. I want you back. You're my child." And Satan's like, "Nah, he's mine. I'm gonna take him and destroy him." So that, because really that's the only way that Satan can get to God. There's nothing that Satan can do to God, but he can destroy humans, which is a way to get at God.
Yeah, and it's even better if you think about outsourcing the destruction of humans by getting them to do it to one another. Now, for example, if you get people to either lie to one another or to mindlessly perpetuate things that turn out to be fraudulent, then you have people harming each other either wittingly or unwittingly. So let's say Britain and France want to go to war, but all they can find, I mean, not all they can find, but the easiest way that they can do it is finding a bunch of Indian tribes in the American Midwest to kill one another. Well, I think we call that the 7 Years' War, and then I think we call it the War of 1812. But this is what we're dealing with here, is people essentially being used as proxies, and oftentimes unwittingly. And this is why everyone has a duty to think about these things whenever they see something, regardless of how much sense it makes. If something doesn't make sense, we actually do have a duty to think through it and to work through it, because deception is constantly being waged against us, especially when we're talking about pharmaceutical companies. We are talking about serial convicted felons, whether it's Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Merck, or any of these others. You're dealing with people who lie constantly and have to pay out billions of dollars for lying. And then they sponsor media groups which are famous for lying. And whenever people hear something from a politician, they'll always say, well, politicians are famous for lying. Okay, cool. So that means when a document comes from any of these people or them all working together, you actually have a duty to dig through and think this through and not merely take something at face value. Because when something doesn't make sense, it's your job to think it through and to look at whether these words actually mean what they're claiming they could mean, in order to avoid deception. Because otherwise you become a mindless perpetuator of harm, or like a repeater of harm and a repeater of deception. And a lot of people have done that. A lot of people, I think, I would say innocently, but I would say less culpably have done so in the last couple of years especially.
And one thing that I really like is Jordan Peterson. I love listening to him, and I've listened to most of his books. I think all of his books, actually. And one of his 12 rules for life is tell the truth, at least don't lie. And then he goes and explains how when you lie, that leads to things like Russia and the Soviet Union. It's like, well, the government was designed to make you have a perfect life. And if you don't have a perfect life, well, then there must be something wrong with you, not the government, because the government's perfect. And so if there's someone standing behind you with the gun saying, how's life? And you're like, well, it's perfect. I got a gun to my head. Well, now you're lying. And that's the basis of the destruction of a society.
Yeah. And actually that's ultimately how the Holodomor took place, even though Jordan Peterson, that's the one book he said he was going to read. He said he was going to get back to us about that later. I hope he does read 200 Years Together and talk about that later. I actually talked to Dr. Merritt about that. But no, you're right. I mean, honestly, you do end up with things like that when it comes to lying, because actually, Dr. Tom Cowan, I think it was, someone asked, how do you stay so sharp in your old age? How do you stay with it? How do you keep your wits about you? And he says, it's easy. I never tell a lie. And then he talked about how lying can actually cause people to develop different pathways in the mind and try and, justify things or understand things or remember an alternate path, or remember an alternate reality, remember a different narrative, try to keep up with it all the time, or trying to process information that's clearly false and try to make sense of it all, just because they're processing information through the lens of having loyalties to those who they think they should trust, even though they clearly can't. So rather than calling out something for the lie that it is, people will take something from an entity that they trust and then try to work through that. And I don't think it's by coincidence that a bunch of people have Alzheimer's and dementia. I think Dr. Cowan's correct that one of the greatest ways to do that is to destroy the pathways in the mind and to destroy the way that the mind works. Eventually, you're going to break it. A lot of people say various different things supposedly cause Alzheimer's, medically speaking, but if we think about it spiritually or in a different kind of biological or different kind of medical sense, that can absolutely destroy someone's brain. If you look at people who are stuck in particular dialectics or who have been believing or preaching lies for such a long time, or things that are just really confusing, when they get old, nothing they say makes sense.
And
because you can't do that forever.
Right. And this is one thing that Jordan Peterson had also said was, how do you know if you're lying or telling the truth? Because sometimes you don't know what the truth is, but you always know what the lie is. And the way you know what the lie is if it's something that makes you feel more weak, that's a lie. The truth will make you feel stronger. It may not be comfortable to say, but you can see what the truth is, and you can judge if it's a lie or not by if it makes you feel or act more weak than you did before you did that or said that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, because otherwise, it really, that statement kind of takes the neutrality out of the whole thing. Because a lot of people would like to say that they neutrally perpetuated something that was negative. So if someone accidentally tells a lie or someone just repeats a lie without thinking about it, yeah, he's at least culpable for his own ignorance in that regard, even if there's no malice there. But yeah, you're right. Whenever someone lies, whenever someone takes the easy way out, whenever someone cheats, so to speak, it will make you feel weaker. It absolutely will. And, you know, when I was going through all this at Fort Huachuca, trying to navigate Frago number 752 coming out 3 days after Frago 743, however many Fragos General Hale managed to crank out in a 72-hour period, I realized all of the different problems with the linguistic manipulation, the fact that IG passed the buck to JAG, that JAG was trying to say that they had actually written these documents and things, and that there could be a problem that you might have to go to the IG for, on and on and on. I turned to my replacement, who was working through all of this with me, and realizing that there was deception going on, and realizing that there was serious contortion and manipulation going on, and I said, you know, man, this feels like a test. And he said it does, because it is. And I think that taking the easy way out would have made me feel weaker, and I think it would have made a lot of people feel weaker. And for some guys, including the man I was just saying, who agreed that it felt like a test, eventually they dangled a third rocker in front of him, and well, he said he would take it if he was forced to, and like, life circumstances changed, and he did, and then he said he felt like a sellout. So the going along with a lie can make you weak too. It can make you feel weak as well, unfortunately.
I think this might be the perfect place to kind of round out today's conversation. It is a test. And it's not like a test like, oh, life's a test. No, this is the test that we, you know, I assume everyone had this same idea when they were in high school and you're learning about the Nazis, and you're like, man, I wonder what would happen if I was in that situation. And, you know, there's that voice in the back of your head says, you know, you would never know unless you're in that situation. Because here you hear everybody saying, I would never do that. I would never do that to any group of people. I would never do that to the Jews or to the gypsies or to, you know, the eugenics. I would never do that. But it's happening right now. That test is happening right now. And if you're on one side of it, then you failed the test. If you're on the other side, you are passing the test.
Yeah, and why did the Soviets have to have NKVD troops during World War II behind all the conscripts waiting to shoot at any man who ran back and fled? Yeah, it doesn't take a whole lot to get people to be willing to do a lot of harm to their own people, unfortunately. Or not their own people. As I said, 200 years together makes it a little easier to understand some of what was happening there, but yeah, you do end up seeing that a lot of people will do a lot of harm, and they don't know until they're in that position. They don't know until they're in that situation. But as long as people, as you said, and as my cousin said, as long as you're willing to walk away from everything, like I'm willing to walk away after 15 years, my cousin's willing to walk away after 18 years. You said you're willing to stop practicing medicine. And you said that they have no power over you once you're willing to walk away. And as long as you don't want too many of the things they can dangle in front of you, as long as you're not too hungry for the carrots they dangle, then you can pass the test, I think. I think that's a big part of it, at least.
And I think the other part of that, when we had that conversation, because you had said, you know, once, you know, I had mentioned once you're willing to give it up, they have no power over you. But you had said something even more powerful, I think, that so many people grasp onto what they want, their job, their position in the military, with so much ferocity that they'll do anything to keep it. And then people like us, nothing's really happened. I mean, I've been suspended. There's been things that have not been good, but
yeah,
eventually they're probably going to ask both of us to stay in, I would imagine, when they can't get other people. And you know what? We're not going to.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. Right. No, I mean, yeah, they've canceled a few TDYs on me. They've pulled a couple assignments up from me. They've changed my position on the M2 a couple times, but okay, I mean, great. The Army does bad things to people. Even if the Army weren't doing this to me, let's say somehow I coasted completely and skated like some of the guys who pretend to take the shot do. I don't want to stay in an organization that treats other people the way it's been treating them. Absolutely not. And I think I told you at one point, if we're talking about an organization that does not respect the law, has no regard for the law, I may as well make money doing it. I may as well throw a suit on, go back to where I grew up, go back to where people from my lineage and descent engage in a whole lot of private sector organized crime as opposed to public sector organized crime, and make way more money working for an organized crime syndicate. It's just that it turns out that I think nowadays, when organized crime syndicates are led by men who have shoulder boards with stars on them, they actually somehow end up making more money than the guys with the suits and the fedoras. So I mean, I'm not gonna stay in or join any other organized crime group, so I don't think I could stay in this one. Because this is organized crime. This is what we're dealing with here, that the insider trading, the profiteering, the forced medical experimentation. It's like, come on. I don't want to be part of something that's hurting so many people like that.
And that's not just your opinion, but also Congressman Thomas Massie had said that this is a crime in progress, and
yes.
that I'm not going to say a name or a position, but what this person is doing is illegal.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, we could also argue that Congress is another crime family, but that's okay too. Congressman Massey did tell the truth and is trying to do the right thing. But I suppose that we could see who the ruler of the world is, and who the prince of the power of the air is, and the powers of the darkness of this world. I mean, principalities exist in republics too, obviously. So any organization is potentially going to be tainted as long as there's deception going on.
Right. Until we have a new heaven, new earth, we'll always have the evil one waiting like a lion ready to destroy.
Right.
Well, thank you, sir. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity.
And I want to also just mention this again, that one of the good things that's come out of this is I speak to men like you and women like you every day who have learned all of these issues themselves and have basically given a self-educated PhD in medicine, in law, in all of these issues, and it's amazing to see. And it will do you well. It will do everyone else who's learned these similar things well, because that means they can adjust and to whatever new path forward will be for them.
Yeah, and a lot of us did put the time into trying to learn and figure this stuff out on the fly, and there was only so much I could do from my position as a 7, but my friends who were 5s and 6s did the same thing. But I really got to thank you for being the only Army doctor that we're seeing coming out swinging as hard as you are, because that does a lot. The position you were in, you absolutely passed the test and made the right choice to help as many people as possible. I don't think we'd have gotten this far or be able to make this much of an impact without a physician who kept the Hippocratic Oath. It's not more than just oath of enlistment, more than just officer's oath. Sorry?
Thank you, but it's not just me. It's also Doctors Lieutenant Colonel Long and retired Lieutenant Colonel P. Chambers, because they've been some heavy hitters that have been able to kind of hang on to their coattails also.
Yes, Colonel Chambers, definitely. I was familiar with his stuff, yeah. But,
well, sir, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Just a reminder for everyone out there, duty uniform of the day, the full armor of God. Let's all make courage more contagious than fear.